Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. With both UN-backed talks in Geneva and Russian broker talks in the resort city of Sochi concluding with no apparent progress for the Syria conflict, the dire reality in the war-torn country continues on a course of bloodshed and humanitarian tragedies, with no international body able to bring the warring sides on course of a tangible political process. To discuss the latest developments, I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Nir Boms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Ze'ev Hanin, who is an expert on Russian and Middle Eastern studies at Ilan and Ariel universities. Welcome.
My pleasure.
Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of the latest developments on this matter.
As if it was not enough that we have had 7 years of conflict within Syria, we also have a conflict between the two mechanisms intended to end the conflict, those that you just mentioned, the Sochi or earlier Astana, Russian-led one, and the UN-led one in Geneva. Now, there are two basic problems here, or even three. One is that you don't have tight alliances. Even within the alliances, which were created either to fight the Assad regime by the opposition or the one formed to fight the Islamic State, there are fissures, there are conflicts, so you can't have a united stand. And the other problem is that there is no UN or global mechanism to impose its will on those parties which really have a veto on the process itself. So if the Syrian opposition doesn't want to take part in the Sochi process and they stage a protest at the airport or wherever in order to show their opposition to what is happening, there will be no solution imposed on them. So what we now have is, at least on the surface, a convergence of the two processes, where Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that he is supporting Staffan de Mistura's effort on behalf of the United Nations, but this, again, is lip service. We are yet to see any real convergence substance-wise.
Dr. Boms?
Well, but it's important to speak about the Russian strategy when it comes to the Syrian conflict, because what we've seen, both on the ground or really on the air, in the case of Russia, and also on the political level, is an attempt, and I think a very successful one, to actually bring the conflict toward an end. The conflict before the Russian intervention is a very different phase than the conflict following the Russian intervention. And the Russians have done two things. First, following, by the way, the JCPOA, following the agreement with Iran, they entered Syria after the sides have been more exhausted, really tilting the arena toward the forces of Bashar al-Assad. They had done this mainly through air control, and through what they've done from before, is really supporting that axis, working with other factors, including with Iran on the ground, and the Iranians have been doing mostly the work on the ground, and the Russians have been doing it from the sky. And at the same token, they had attempted to take over some of the political process in a fairly wise way, and creating a political process, at least de facto, if not the Euro political process, if not a de facto one. So from their perspective, they say, look, we have a political process, we have a de-escalation zone. Sure, somebody may be violating it, there may be some battles on the ground, but that's the problem of the people violating it, because we're supposed to have an end conflict and we're supposed to support this, and this really enables them to be the arbitrator, both on the military side, on the events on the ground, and also on the political arena.
Professor Hanin?
I actually agree with what Amir and Nir said, but I would also say that after talking about success of Russia in Syria, I would say that we should pay a few moments in order to say what are the pieces of disadvantage of Russia there. In fact, what we hear from Moscow, what we can read or hear between the lines in their media, actually addressed to 3 points. One point First of all, they were unsuccessful in order in conversion of what is called Geneva and Astana Sochi process. In fact, all the subjects actually were unable to come into agreement, and it's mostly not due to disagreement between the Middle Eastern subject, but rather between Russia and the United States. Until just a couple of days ago, we heard from a person from Moscow who is actually quite close to the, how they call it, decision-making circles, that he said that they until now are waiting from some indication from Washington that they are ready to come into direction of Russia in order just to show that between Russia and the United States there is some sort of warming of the relations. Meantime, they are lacking any indication from Washington. The second point actually is the fact that these two combinations of forces of two alliances that we see in Syria, meaning the anti-ISIS alliance on one hand, and Russia, Syrian Assad, and Iranian alliance against the Sunni bloc, or you can define it differently. My colleagues might say, might choose a different word. Are actually are not. In fact, Russians are unable to gain from the cooperation between two. We all the time say that they're successful in order to keep Mr. Assad in power, but in fact, what's next? And in fact, there is nothing next. I mean, at the moment in Moscow, they don't understand what is going to be further. Third point. And third disadvantage, actually there is disagreement between two allies of Russia here or there in Syria, between Turkey and Iran. They believe that they can bring all these two subjects together under the auspices of Russia. At the moment, it's never happened. Mm-hmm. And fourth point, actually we're coming back to the conflict between Russia and Turkey. After the Turkey actually Turkish-supported local forces attacked the Russian plane and actually killed their pilot. So again, if you will read Russian media, there is just an explosion of hatred against Turkey. Of course, the Russian government and president could take it, is able not to take it on the granted, but still should take some point into account.
Nevertheless, it seems like all parties or international parties that actually have somewhat of a say in the war in Syria have come to a realization that in order to bring a political process to their side, they need to change the reality on the ground and support various operations in order to bolster their proxies in Syria. Mr. Oren, tell us more about that.
Well, one must remember the timeline. It all started some 7 years ago in 2011, and then we had in 2013 the Russian-American agreement against the Syrian chemical weapons. So it seemed as if they might get some agreement regarding the future of the Assadist regime without Bashar Assad himself. But then in 2014, the Islamic State rose out of nowhere. So priorities changed, and the American priority is still against ISIS first. And because ISIS also has its eye on Iraq, the division of Syria is now not north to south, as the Turks might want, because they are interested in the north, in their border, but east and west. The eastern part of Syria, which is mostly a desert, but adjacent to Iraq, is under American control. This is east of the Euphrates River. West of the Euphrates, it's Russia. The Americans don't really care what happens west of the Euphrates, including in the coastal strip, including Damascus, except for the southern border with Jordan and with Israel. This is their only interest. And because of that, because they have left a vacuum, they are really giving Russia control of the most important part of Syria, and they couldn't really care less about the opposition.
Hasn't this actually brought the American area, which is controlled by the SDF alliance, backed by the United States-led coalition, to make quite significant mistakes during this course of time? For instance, if we look at Palmyra, after the Russians conquered it together with the Syrian army and the Shiite militias backed by Iran, we saw a big team of Russian forces coming and demining the area and making sure that the people can safely return to their houses and also control that city more decisively, as opposed to Raqqa, where we saw the Kurdish forces bringing straight away the people back, and we hear about dozens, if not hundreds, of people being killed by various bombs that were still not detonated, different challenges that those US-backed forces are currently facing on the ground.
Yes, but this is inherent in the reality, where you had one common enemy, the Islamic State. But apart from that, you had conflicts between the various allies. For instance, the Kurds, which you mentioned, and the United States, looking from above, wants to keep Turkey, a major NATO ally, on its side. At the same time, it needs the Kurds. It still needs the Kurds in Iraq. And it tries to juggle the two. The Russians have less of a problem because they are only for Assad, and even that is secondary. The primary reason the Russians are there is to have their own interest, their own naval base, their own air base. It's a sort, perhaps Professor Hanin would agree with me, it's a sort of a Kaliningrad, an enclave, a coastal enclave outside of their borders. They couldn't care less whether Lithuania and Poland are on two sides of Kaliningrad, or if Syria and Turkey and Lebanon are surrounding their enclave between Tartus and Latakia.
Dr. Boms?
So in that sense, the American interest and the Russian interests are indeed different. And the American interests are narrower, particularly more recently. I mean, aside of the broader will to end the conflict and save lives and bring peace and world order, the Americans under President Obama and then following under President Trump had said, look, we have first and foremost the priority of ISIS. And then we actually are willing to work with the Russians, sometimes more so, sometimes less so, because we're not really interested in increasing the signature in the region. For the Russians, it's different. They would like to increase their signature in the region. They would like to make sure that they're going to be the wheelers and dealers. They would like to make sure that not only the military and the access to the port, but also following that, the access to the gas reservoirs, the access to energy portal are going to remain their own. And therefore, they need to have access not just to Syria, but throughout the region. And they would like to make sure that they will remain the main arbitrators, so that people will need to come to them for dealing with issues and for dealing with the political issues. The Americans are saying, look, we have a narrower objective, and at some point we were not even sure if they will end up staying there. And of course, people were having this discussion of what is really the American policy. The Russians are there to stay. By the way, the Iranians are there to stay as well.
That even after they already declared on several occasions about the United States staying in northern Syria and backing the various forces that they were there fighting the Islamic State with?
Well, if you're following the time trajectory, we've seen statements going this direction and that direction. The Americans so far have said, look, we're staying at least, and we just heard it recently, for another year and a half. A part of it is really understanding, perhaps, of how the geopolitics work, to make sure that the American will still give a little bit of weight, not just for the sense of the battle against ISIS, but also to make sure that they will actually have a say in this game, because this game is not just about Syria. It's really about the region at large, and it's also about trying to counterweight some of the Russians' attempts, and that do not necessarily stand in line with the interests of America and certainly with its allies, something that is very much relevant to what's happening here in our southern border.
Professor Hanin?
It makes no sense to argue and to disagree with what colleagues said, that in fact Americans were ready to accept the idea of division of power of influences between eastward or westward of the river. And in principle, Americans really were first of all interested to destroy the whole infrastructure of radical Sunni Islamism in this area, and are ready to accept the support of anybody. But it seems to me that as far as the situation is developing, Americans less and less interested to go on with the same idea of letting Iranians to enter the vacuum that first were created after the destruction of Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq, and second time of the destruction of IS, of Islamic State in Syria. So it seems to me that Americans are not interested to make the same mistake. Why? As they did when they let Iranians to recapture or destroy the southern Kurdistan in northern Iraq, and they are not going to let the same thing happen in northern Syria. And let us not forget that there is another country here in the Middle East, the country which is called the State of Israel, which is in fact also in some way involved into the whole story. In principle, we were probably the only country in the Middle East that were just observers. But it's not. We are going to be a more active part in case the agreements or understandings between Jerusalem and Moscow are not in order at the moment. So when Mr. Netanyahu immediately after Davos ran to Moscow in order to understand whether this agreement in order or not in order, most probably the answer was negative. Mr. Putin said a lot of nice words, and saying that Russia at the moment has two allies in the Middle East. One is Iran and another in Israel. They understand that Russia is not the Soviet Union and is unable to stand with one leg here in the Middle East. It needs two legs, but nothing more than that. In fact, when the question was asked whether all the three understandings that were reached before, meaning that Syria will not be a transportation point for weapons changing the rules of the game to Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies, whether the question of Ramat Golan, the Golan Heights, will not be on the table after on the negotiations about Syria, and whether Iranians will not be able to open another front on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. The first question was, do whatever you want. I mean, we're not going to interfere. The second, we don't know. And the third is no. Meaning all this dislocation zone or relocation zone, whatever you call it, actually that, in fact, Russians are not ready to stand on that or stand above that. Meaning, in case, coming back to Americans, in case westward from Euphrates, that will be a Russian zone, it's okay with Americans, it's okay with us. But in fact, Russians immediately transferred it to Iranians, and that's already not good for Israel. We disagree with that, and it seems to me that Americans are not happy with that either.
Well, I'd like to actually pull one step backwards and look again at the political process and the viability of things. Obviously, whatever happens on the ground is eventually what will take place in the future, and regardless of the various powers, be it Moscow or Washington, one of the key players is Turkey, which of course has also the longest stretching border with Syria on the one hand, and also the ability to invade Syria on several fronts, as it is currently doing in Afrin region, as well as its aspiration to do so in Manbij and other districts in order to confront the YPG militia, which is the key force of the SDF alliance, again, backed by the United States. Mr. Oren, when we're looking at the current positioning on the political front of Ankara, on the one hand, of course, it has somewhat of a strategic understanding with Moscow and Tehran, but on the other hand, it is not happy with the latest developments in Idlib region, which is also adjacent to its border with on the Syrian-Turkish border. We see Assad's forces making headway, conquering new territories, and kicking out a lot of Islamists, primarily who are controlling that area, but those Islamists and their families are retreating, of course, towards the Turkish border, which may bring about quite significant challenges, both for Turkey and for the European Union. Do you believe that the unwillingness or the inability of Moscow and Tehran to rein in Assad's forces will shift again Ankara westwards, or is the constraint or the all-time low relations between Moscow and Ankara going to just isolate Turkey in dealing with everything by its own?
Well, Erdogan is not committed to consistency. He could support one side at one time and then shift his support according to his own interest or the way he perceives his interest. And there is an optical illusion here perhaps born out of the successful armistice talks that Israel had with its Arab neighbors in 1949, and then what happened after the Sinai or Suez campaign in 1956. In the first occasion, the United Nations, with Assistant Secretary General Ralph Bunche, brokered a series of agreements, and in another, Canadian Foreign Minister Lester Pearson suggested the United Nations emergency force in the Sinai as a sort of a fig leaf for withdrawal from the Sinai, giving the Israeli government a pretext to show its domestic audience that it has left its conquests, but everything is fine. This was good whenever there were invasions by foreign forces and wars ensued, and there was an outside intervention. But in a civil war, it is very hard to broker peace from the outside. And what you have with Turkey, the Turks intervening in Syria, is actually two civil wars. You have the Syrian civil war in which the Kurds take part, and you have a sort of a civil war in Syria, in Turkey, the Ankara regime against the PKK, against its own underground. And because the Turks are afraid that the Kurds in Syria are helping the Kurds in Turkey, you can't separate the two civil wars. So whatever Russia or Iran want has to do with their foreign policy ambitions. For Turkey, it's an internal security matter.
Dr. Boms, the proxy or the rebels that Turkey is backing, the FA or the Free Syrian Army, the FSA, they are or were in the past the Western-backed rebels that were primarily combating the Assad regime. Of course, after losing significant grounds on several fronts in Syria, Turkey has decided to back them fully and has been using them to fight alongside its forces in northern Syria. To what extent does this actually bring the Free Syrian Army back into the picture when we're talking about the political process?
Well, I think one of the tragedies of the Syrian conflict is that Syria, that used to be a nationalistic, secular country, got itself involved in a conflict that had brought the religious and the more extreme sides much deeper in it. The Free Syrian Army, that at the beginning, at the genesis, was comprised of officers who decided to withdraw from the Syrian army and established the Free Syrian Army in order to create change, had been weakened. The militias, backed up by a good number of proxy players, Turkey certainly being one of them, created a reality in where the Free Syrian Army architecture inside was tilted again toward the Islamist militias. And now, when they're again being pushed from most of the arenas because they have lost most of them, some remain in the south. That's actually one of the last bastions of some of the original ones and along the border with Israel, and in the north, in the Idlib province, where many of them belong to the Free Syrian Army, but they belong to the militias that are more on the Islamist side of things and are more connected with their proxy
including
funders.
Those that are backed currently by Turkey? Including
those who are backed currently by Turkey. And this is, by the way, why the reasons why you keep on having even the recent airplane that was targeted and successfully, and you have a militia that the people are saying, and the Russians are saying, look, perhaps on the one hand the weapon is brought from Ukraine, whether it's true or not, that means little difference for the narrative itself, and on the other hand these are militias supported by Turkey, and now we're coming back to the Turkish-Russian tension. So that's a part of the new reality and a part of the tragedy of all of this. Will that bring the Free Syrian Army back to the domain? To some degree, I hope that some of the opposition and some of the Free Syrian Army, at least some of its elements that are more pragmatic, would come back to the fold. But these elements had received the least of support from the proxy powers, while the militias had received more of them. We just seen a report on the other side of things. There are no less than 88 different militias fighting just on the Assad side. the militias coming on the opposition side are even numerous than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes hopes and aspirations, primarily when it comes to Syria, are quite detached from reality. Professor Hanin, how do you think that Russia is currently trying to revive this process after what is seen as a failed attempt in Sochi?
The best they would be interested or they were able to get in Syria is actually to preserve the regime of right-wing Ba'athist party in power with Mr. Assad or without him. They would prefer with Assad, but they might agree if the payment will be substantial to remove him personally, but to preserve regime in cooperation with Iran and under the auspices of Russia. What they're not interested to see there is actually the total domination of Iran, where Russian oil companies are not there and Russian influence is not there, and maximum Moscow got is actually 1 point in the shore of the Mediterranean for the Russian ships, military ships, and some other services, but not more than that. Actually, they would be interested to come again into cooperation with the United States in case they would get some indication from Washington that they are ready to remove the sanctions or ready to decrease the sanctions and to come to the agreement with Russia in concern of the situation in Eastern Europe. And finally, what we will not see there, and that's in Russia's favor, works in Russian favor, that Turkey will not see the Sunni pro-Turkey regime that will replace the Assad regime with the support of Iran. In this case, Russians would be ready for sort of Syrian confederation, what might probably even the Kurds and other minorities will have some sort of their self-dominance, self-determination, but not to change the official internationally recognized the borders of Syria, of Syrian Republic. Finally, Israel and Russia. In case this will be the way, Jerusalem would agree with that. In case the United States would agree, and most probably that's the case. But
does Moscow take Jerusalem's interest into account?
Yeah, absolutely. They're interested that we will not be, Israel will not be a subject in this case, just an observer. Moscow actually is ready for all these Israeli operations, whoever did that, and understands that as far as the Russian forces there are not damaged, they agree that Israel will preserve their interest there. In the situation that everybody but Russia is actually playing game there, after all these proclamations that Russia won and got everything, whatever it was able to get, it was really funny. In the sittings, in the procedures of Russian parliament, there was an expert in the Syrian situation that said that the first time in Russia history we won with not implementing a lot of blood. That's the Syrian war. But in fact, from this point of view, they would be interested that the situation would continue in case, but that's not the case at the moment.
Well, closing statement from you, Dr. Boms?
The Syrian conflict has reached a new phase, and I think the Russian strategy overall is the dominant one vis-a-vis some of its other proxies. It's not over yet, but I believe that what we'll see is that Russia will keep on pushing for its own interests first and foremost.
The Russians are the victors because the Americans don't care. Trump is neither an ideologue nor for human rights. He's a real politician. He will sell the Kurds down the river, and Russia will win, perhaps Turkey too.
Well, we'll have to wait and see what will truly happen out of this. I see that Professor Hanin doesn't agree, but we'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss this further. Dr. Boms, I'd like to thank you for coming here, Mr. Oren and Professor Hanin as well. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.